So this is our textbook. There's the ISBN numbers if you need to take a screenshot. I'm sure you already have it. It's in the bookstore, they tell me. And we've been using this one now since January, no, yeah, no, since last fall. And the reason is that Whitcott and La Posada did not come out with a later editions of the 16-week or 18-week soft cover textbook. And it was getting so out of date that it was embarrassing to use it. So that's when I asked my colleagues, what textbook are you using? And I think Meredith Leonard told me she's using this one. So we do make an effort to use the same textbook in all sections of Environmental Science 1 at Valley. And that's in case students need to change sections. Back when we were in person, that was not an unusual request. Scheduling would mean a student needed to change sections. So to make it as easy as possible, if we're all using the same textbook, then it's not a big hurdle for the student to change sections. Supposedly, you are actually seeing my Chrome window here with the Agricanto site. What I have on agricanto.org when you click on table of contents is our class, Environmental Science 1 Valley, and here's summer. So what's different about this is that there's a lot less on it than Canvas. There is the syllabus and course description. It's a PDF file, and when you click on it, it'll probably open in a separate window, and you can download it and have it on your disk drive. You can print it, do whatever you want. Then there's a link to the book itself, which is what we were looking at in the previous window from McGraw-Hill. And then there's assignments 1 and 2 are described here. We won't have to go to them until we get there. But there's entire pages on Weebly that describe and help you through these assignments. Then something recommended at Valley is the library put out this document called What is Plagiarism? Today, that really needs a lot more attention than we used to give it in the past. Well, because of AI and Chat GPT. But now with AI, it isn't. So it is an outdated document. The takeaway I would say is if you're passing off someone else's work, and that someone could be a machine, as your own, in other words, you're putting your name on it when you didn't, in fact, produce it, then put simply, that's plagiarism. And that is a real big taboo in higher education. So that the main default is just cite your sources so that you're not accused of plagiarism, so that you're not claiming I wrote that. You're saying Joe Smith wrote that. Annie Rogers wrote that. And that should placate the accusations of plagiarism. There is a nine-minute lesson in environmental literacy that I think is it's convenient to have. I found it. Let me see if it comes up when it comes up. It does. Okay, and it's an article. It just has like what are the basic things. So I got this one in Medium some years back in 2018, but it has about 9, maybe 10 different points. So there is the water scarcity of the world. They chose number 1. Thank you, because we live in California. Food waste. The hottest years, and this is 2018. So since 2018, we've had hotter and hotter and hotter years. So that now 2023 is the record-holding year, and the records that you see here are in fact now out of date. What else? Love Canal. What happened? Number 3. Number 3 was the hottest years. Number 4 is toxicity. Places like Love Canal dumping. Everywhere where, look at the issue in Los Angeles for us is what about uncapped oil and gas wells, which are in residential neighborhoods all over LA. The 5th one is, it's a tiny little country called Bhutan. It's tucked in the eastern Himalaya. It's between, China and India. And it's an interesting country. They measure their economic well-being with a different yardstick than most countries. So most countries do GDP per capita. That's one of the favorite economic measures. The United Nations uses something called the Human Development Index, and Bhutan uses something called the Happiness Index. So they actually have as a sort of mission of government to ensure people's happiness. But being a Buddhist country, they don't define happiness as a trip to Walmart. So it's not a super consumer society, and yet people strive to be however they would define happiness. So it's interesting, Bhutan. It's always draws attention. I wouldn't say that it's a thriving social democracy. I think Bhutan's a kingdom. So it's sort of a, what do you want to call it, an authoritarian utopia? Six is Overshoot Day. This is a day each year when humanity's resource consumption exceeds the planet's capacity to regenerate those resources that year. In other words, when you're living off, an overextended bank account, and it moves into August. I think now, when this one was done, the first Overshoot Day was in 1970. That was also the founding of Earth Day, the sort of beginning of the environmental movement writ large. And the day that was called Overshoot was December 29th. Okay, meaning you had to wait to the end of the year to finally have used up more resources than replenishing and regeneration were capable of producing. But then today it has slid backwards. I wonder if they give us a date here. No, they don't. It's in August. We now have Overshoot Day in August, and that's happened in 50 years, 50 plus. So that's an important calendar event. And although number 7 is the changes that are being done that are positive in particular addressing the climate problem. But one of them, this is not reduced or restricted to the climate problem. There is the problem of ozone depletion in the stratosphere, which we'll talk about in the atmosphere chapter, that created the so-called hole in the ozone over Antarctica. And in fact, it has been closing up thanks to international agreements on reducing chlorofluorocarbons that are mainly responsible for the destruction of ozone in the stratosphere. Footnote, ozone in the stratosphere is good. It protects us from excessive ultraviolet light. And if it's missing, then too much ultraviolet light reaches the Earth's surface, and that's not good for organisms. Plastic pollution. There are trying to redesign urbanism, redefine what a city is to make cities greener. Los Angeles has actually quite significant commitments in that regard. The greening of LA. There's in fact a whole dashboard for, I think, LA County that has milestones, it has objectives, it has dates, and it brings together everything: transportation, housing, water, waste, air pollution. It's all in one dashboard for LA County. So there are, believe it or not, Los Angeles actually has made incredible strides in trying to become a greener city. Then let's see. The Catholic Church, meaning the Pope, had two what do they call it? Encyclicals, papal encyclicals on climate. And the most recent one was the most far-reaching one, but it's actually significant in that the Pope brought together over there in Rome, in Vatican, all kinds of climate leaders and scientists and opinion makers, people like Naomi Klein and so on. So it's a well-informed encyclical. And number of species, including the panda bear, are no longer on the endangered list. So to the extent that conservation measures work to protect endangered species, they actually have worked. And in some cases, some endangered animals have been taken off the list, meaning they're not endangered anymore. So in the US, that is called the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. And in international terms, it's known as the Red List, which is compiled by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they update that list every year and either add species or remove species that have actually gone extinct, or demote species that are no longer highly endangered, or add new ones that have suddenly become endangered. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral structure in the world, and has been, in fact, quite affected by. But it said that scientists have managed to breed corals from the Great Barrier Reef and transplant them back into the wild. Back at the page on the Agricanto page, there is I try to curate this link, even though I haven't visited it in a while, to provide information on the coronavirus. And then there is 4 episodes on PBS that are introduction to the environment, and they're short. They're really worth watching because Some of them even emphasize what kind of employment would somebody who studies environmental science um, find, depending on their concentration within the field of environmental science. So let's say your emphasis was water, then ideally, actually, I'll also take you to my other website where we list links to all kinds of sources. You can see right up here, it goes home, contact, links, films, articles, Sustainable Environment Institute. That is my other hat. Beth Abels from Pierce College and Zhao Behlenhorf, our chief librarian at Valley, and me, we together are the Sustainable Environment Institute. We try to curate this page, meaning that it gets updated. This is something Zhao did for Valley College on climate anxiety and with appropriate resources. So when you go up here and you go to links, the furthest one on the right, you'll see that there's a bunch of organizations that are national, and then there's regional local organizations, and then there's a list of California degrees, colleges, and resources, either by the kinds of schools that they are, by area of focus, popular degree programs. Over on the left here, the regional ones is things like Tree People Heal the Bay, Pacoima Beautiful. Those are all our local environmental organizations. And that does include even some that are national with local chapters, like the U.S. Green Building Council. These are the videos I've posted here that are about high-paying jobs in environmental science, jobs that only require a bachelor's degree. She's done these, she's put together these, she's very good at it. And she's put together what to do with your major, what to do with a bachelor's degree, or do you need a master's degree if you want a really high paying job in environmental science? She answers all those questions really well. And even though it might be a bit dated now, it's still a really good primer on what do I do with my college degree. And then on the right side, you can see there's the degree programs. I've been requested by and get emails from organizations saying, can you please add a link to your links page for our education program? So this links here they're all environmental education. I really try to avoid putting links there to services, organizations, nonprofits that are not explicitly environmental. And sadly, I get too many requests, from whatever it is, the Toasters Club or whatever. So I do try to curate this in a way where it works. And on the list, you'll notice it's Southwest has a new student union building. So sometimes there's a link here that isn't an actual organization or a study program. So that is our book. And I get the ebook. Well, they gave me the book because I'm an instructor, but I also got the ebook so that I can carry it around on my iPad. All right. This is the first slide in chapter 1 called Understanding Our Environment. So it does sort of orient you through what's in the book and how they defined environmental studies, environmental science in particular. This happens to be, it doesn't say, it's the Amazon rainforest. So it looks like what you might imagine, very, very green, very lush, full of different kinds of species of trees. Interesting thing about the tropics, the closer you get to the equator, the higher the species variety, or you could say the richness of species. The further you get from the equator, you find more species abundance and less variety. So that if you look at the most extensive forests in the world today that remain standing, it's known as the taiga, or the boreal forest. And it's only found in the northern hemisphere, and it's a subarctic, meaning it's below the Arctic Circle, and it stretches all around the northern hemisphere. All of Russia, Scandinavia, Canada, Alaska, they all have boreal forest. But when you fly over the boreal forest, what you see is that all the trees are evergreens, they're all conifers, and there's very little variety. There's maybe 3 or 4 kinds of conifers, and that's the whole forest. You go into the Amazon and you might find a tree that you identify as a member belonging to a certain species. And then you look for the next one that is the same species. You might travel 10 miles downriver to find the next representative of that species. That's how much species diversity there is in the tropics. It's fantastically diverse. So increased diversity toward the equator, increased abundance toward the poles. So this is a composite image created by satellite telemetry. So this is remote sensing from way out there. By the way, if it is something you're interested in, it's a huge field. And it's part of geography typically, so that, for example, at UCLA geography, they have a whole program in remote sensing. And if I remember right, we had the same thing at Berkeley. They either download imagery from satellites that are dedicated to doing earth science, and there are quite a few. There's climate satellites, there's ocean satellites, there's forest satellites, and they download the imagery with dates and with color correction, all of that, and then interpret it. Remote sensing also includes, flying over in a helicopter and taking pictures. So the remote sensing library at UCLA for geography is interesting because it has a lot of just aerial photography going back to the 1920s. So it's Los Angeles through the decades. This is the city of Santarém on the Amazon River near Manaus, which is probably a city you've heard of if you haven't heard of Santarém. Notice the little sort of herringbone structures that are the brown areas, where there's a line down, you could say the middle, and then it's radiating out like a dead fish, the ribs. That's the process of deforestation. So the way it begins is they build a road, of course, and then from that road, inroads away from that road into the forest, removing the trees and bringing in soybeans and cattle. So the main two culprits of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon is the logging industry, just remove the trees, but the replacement of the forest with soybeans and cattle ranches. That's the region that they focused on. It's interesting. There's so many geographic mistakes in this book. I want to send them a letter. That's not the Amazon. This is the Amazon. Manaus is up here. So this little rectangle doesn't correspond at all to the map they just showed us. Just lazy cartographers. This region of Brazil is known as the Pantanal. It's unique in the world. It borders, I think, with Bolivia. And during the rainy season, the entire region floods with several meters of water. It's incredibly diverse in terms of what it supports, but for many months of the year, the Pantanal is kind of a sunken land. And with everything where people live, it all kind of sticks up above the water. And then this is the Sertão, which is a drier region of northeastern Brazil. A lot of emigration from here into the Amazon, people who are looking for land to grow crops. So the Amazon colonists are both landless peasants from the northeast of Brazil, hungry for land, needing somewhere to plant crops, and being helped by the government to do that. Because if the government didn't give them land or send them away into the Amazon, they would have to address the problem of who owns the land in northeast Brazil, and that would involve land reform, and that would involve confronting landlords and cattle ranchers. They don't want to do that. So just send the poor peasants to the Amazon. Bye-bye. So this is a region of poverty in Brazil, increased impoverishment. And then the southern Brazil is the most urbanized region. All the big cities are here, highest population concentrations, and a slightly less, milder climate than you get at the equatorial zone. So what is environmental science? On the right side, this is from Withcott and La Posada. It's very kind of them to do this. The only mistake in this one is that they're calling it all environmental science. And you'll see in a minute that's how does this work? Everything on the right side of the rows here is environmental science, meaning that all of these fields of study contribute to addressing environmental problems as understood by the sciences of ecology, biology, chemistry, atmospheric science, oceanography, geology, and in this case, physical geography. So they all contribute to how we get information, interpret data, combine that data into making comprehensive, holistic, and useful statements about environmental problems, and ideally, what would be the solutions. So this half of the rows is environmental science. This half is environmental studies. It's social sciences and humanities. So they've misnamed this. I should change this diagram. And so what is environmental studies? At the very bottom, you'll see that it includes archaeology. Archaeology straddles the both because the methods of archaeology are in many ways very scientific. You use LIDAR, use ground penetrating radar, you use excavation tools. There are many rules. And if any of you have taken anthropology class at Valley, they even have an archaeology class where you learn that careful method of excavation. And how do you excavate antiquity? How do you excavate dinosaurs? How do you not destroy what you're excavating for? And that's why archaeology is a very interesting field, because with new technologies, it's turned the field upside down. To give you an idea, archaeologists had suggested that the population of the Americas before the arrival of the colonists from Europe, they had said it. It's I forget how many million. I'm just saying that they say it's 11 million, but whatever. Um, but they did that based on the gathering of the data that they had, and they did that with the accounts that the colonizing powers made when they conquered what they called New Spain, Brazil, the Americas, etc. They reported back to the crown or back to the church what they were learning about the pre-Columbian civilizations that they were busily destroying. So some of the numbers come from those accounts. But today, with ground penetrating radar and with remote radar, which is fascinating, remote radar where you could literally take like a balloon or a little blimp and float it over an area like a rainforest. And the radar signals go through the trees and even through several inches, maybe even several feet of dirt. So these ground penetrating radar can be airborne, and suddenly they're going over these rainforests in Yucatan and finding that the Mayan cities that they thought had populations of 10,000 had populations of 20,000. Once they could see how big the city actually was, how many little streets and little houses and so on were now devoured by the rainforest, but they're there, their ruins are there. So you don't have to take a pick and shovel and a brush to every mound of dirt and start digging. You can use technologies today that will produce a pretty decent map of what's underneath your feet without you having to go and dig it all up. But it has, in many ways, one of the things we learned from new archaeological methodology is that the population of the Americas was easily double what the official statements have been thus far, which is very important from the point of view of the indigenous people whose roots are the indigenous populations of the continent before the arrival of colonists, because it helps them situate their own epic story, as it were, whether they're descendants of Nahuatl-speaking people, Mayan people, Quechua-speaking people, etc. Anthropology goes without saying that it is a social science to a great degree. It studies human societies, hence anthropo. We'll see that word a lot in environmental science because we talk about anthropogenic climate change, meaning climate change induced by people. So anthropo refers to humans. So this is the study of humans. And there is physical anthropology, which is the evolution of humans. Think of, Australopithecus, those kinds of names. And then there is cultural geography, which is, languages, religion, dress, changes in codes, and so on. So it's a big field. It's a lot like geography, which has both a physical geography and what I think at Valley we call cultural geography, or just human geography. So there's economic geography, political geography, there's cartography. All those things are the human geography elements to what would be geology, geomorphology, coastal zone studies, which is physical geography. History, this is actually one of the biggest fields in environmental studies. Biggest by that, I mean, some of the most significant writing in the field of environmental studies is in this category, environmental history. And some of the best writers have been, in fact, environmental historians. I think, Bill McKibben, he got famous when he published a book I think was called The End of Nature. And it's an environmental history book. Political science, this goes without saying because so much of what we can do or try to do regarding environmental problems is government intervention in the marketplace through regulatory systems, creation of regulatory agencies, standards, norms, compliance. All those things are environmental law. And to do environmental law, you need to go to law school. It helps to have had a degree in political science. It's a very normal or typical road to environmental law is through poli-sci, but it isn't the only one. My undergraduate major at Berkeley was conservation, and we had an environmental law cluster, meaning students that wanted to go on to law school and do environmental law, but they weren't doing poli-sci, but they were doing environmental history, conservation standards, etc. So this is often for people that want to get into politics, either because they want to run for elected office or they want to work for government agencies that have purviews over the solutions to environmental problems. Engineering, this one is almost out of place because it's really what we call CTE. It's not really environmental studies or environmental science. It's engineering. It's job training, for example. But there are so many new technologies to address, for example, electric cars, all electric cars, driverless taxis. All that stuff is engineering. So to the extent that it addresses an environmental problem, you'll see that it gets into our book. Environmental economics, this is also a field that is really important, and there's important debates within the field of environmental economics. So economists that call themselves ecological economists or environmental economists, they're not the same as an economist that might be working for the banking sector. Environmental economists look a lot at the valuation of nature, if you want to use a term that they would use, and therefore the devaluation of nature. So they try to quantify the process whereby modern industrial urban systems are destroyers of natural systems, and what are the economic costs of doing that. That's just one of the things that environmental economists look at. But if you wanted to calculate how much money do we need to invest globally to wean the world from fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, and double and triple down on renewables, an environmental economist is the kind of person that will try to put a dollar figure on that with time spans. Like, if we spend $3 trillion in the next 5 years, we can, dot, dot, dot. Environmental ethics. This is also one that, for example, where I did my work at UC Berkeley, it was a big part of the major I was in. And it's ethics and philosophy. A lot of really important environmental writing actually comes under this category. You could say that we are probably socially incapable of the radical change that our current dilemma requires of us without a change in our ethics. So that is why, now I'm exaggerating a bit, obviously, because change happens sometimes gradually and sometimes it happens rather suddenly, like AI, it's rather suddenly. Well, there's an example, how should we deal ethically with artificial intelligence? It's a really good question. And you can be sure right now that there's raging discussions in philosophy departments and engineering and so on. How do we put ethical guardrails on artificial intelligence? So this will always be important, even though it sounds a little bit, it's all humanities, it's kind of philosophical, it's kind of mushy, because if you combine ethical concerns with environmental law, then you're getting into how do you make public policy around issues that affect everybody or are urgent, then you do need ethical standards in a sense. I'm going to use scaffolding that informs or helps you locate, helps you stack the problems, the solutions that you're looking at in a way that is cohesive, that makes overall sense. And that's why humans are often obsessed with ethics. Many types of knowledge are needed in environmental science. A few examples are shown here. Oh, it just doesn't tell you what the cute little monkey is. And so economics, anthropology, arts, humanities, policy, of course, this is public policy, this is law, etc. Chemistry, population biology, what resources do species need, and the challenges. In this case, the challenge is conserving biodiversity, and then here are multidisciplinary answers. In other words, different disciplines contributing to how to address the challenge. It's interesting that this picture would be in our book because the astronaut who took this picture just passed away yesterday or the day before. I think at the ripe old age of 85. He didn't make it to the moon. He was in Apollo 8. So the Apollo 8 mission was to basically orbit the moon. And when they had come around, going back toward Earth, he took this famous snapshot of what's called the Earthrise, the rising Earth. And you can see the starkness and bleakness of the moonscape in front of just craters and rocks and nothing alive at all. And then there's that blue dot just teeming with life. And and not to mention that it's quite a beautiful blue dot. So this picture was, we thought, I'm old, that it would change people's view toward the Earth, that we would then appreciate, um, Buckminster Fuller's spaceship Earth concept, that we live in a system that's completely finite. It's like an island. So we have to live within our means. We have to reduce how much we waste. We have to reduce how much we use up. We have to make the Earth a sustainable place for generations to come. And we thought that this picture would kind of make people see the Earth and not as my little chunk of it, which has, a nation state or an ethnicity or a religion or a language group, which is how humans interact today. We don't interact with each other as Earthlings. We interact with each other as members of different groups, often in conflict with each other. So the idea was that this image would reduce people's penchant for conflict and increase people's affinity. It didn't do that. And it's an interesting question. Why did these images, and we do live in a world where images are very important, why did they not change the world? Because some images have. I mean, you could say that Andy Warhol's Campbell's Soup painting did more to change people's perception than Earthrise as a photograph. And that's the weird thing about living in a consumer society that is driven by hyperconsumption and therefore by advertising and commerce and consumption, which was the subject of Andy Warhol's art, and not see the value of a photograph because it's just another photograph. I had a colleague at UC Berkeley who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the image of the whole Earth. It was actually a pretty decent doctoral dissertation. And that was, so whatever I'm saying about it is something I picked up from his insights about it. But it's still an incredibly beautiful, thought-provoking image that we should all have on the wall, or at least it should be on the wall of every church in the world, but I get carried away. This lovely little critter is the most amazing, doesn't tell you what, it just says, oh, rich diversity of life. But there's a name of this. It's not the orange one from Costa Rica is the one that's gone extinct. But I wish they'd tell us which one this is. It just says the source is Getty Images, which, by the way, is one of the biggest image repositories on Earth. They just collect them, and that's why you often will see it as a caption on an image that it comes from Getty Images, which is right there on the Sepulveda Pass at the Getty Center. There is good old Greta Thunberg, and this young woman has caught so much flack. In fact, I think in the world of right-wing politics, they even have a whole we hate Greta industry. I love this woman because, well, she started doing this when she was very young. I think she was 15, maybe younger. She started her climate strikes in Sweden, so that's in Swedish, and it's School Strike for Climate. And she would basically put this placard up in front of the Houses of Parliament in Stockholm every Friday. And it caught on. And she became sort of an international figure. And she actually is, neurodiverse, if that's the right word. She's on the spectrum. She's a slight Asperger's, is the term that used to be used in identifying highly functional autism was Asperger's syndrome. That term is no longer used, and the spectrum is just seen as a spectrum. So there's on one end of it, if you will, there's the Greta Thunbergs of the world. And the few people I've known that have this this characteristic is that they're amazingly one-pointed. It's Greta cares a lot about the climate and makes no bones about it. My friend Dylan, who has Asperger's, we used to live in the same house. His one-pointed thing was chess. He'd walk in with the chessboard. George, time to play chess. He taught me a lot about chess, and he loves chess. So we do chess. I know this other kid who's airplanes. He wants to fly airplanes. He model airplanes. It's airplanes all day, and I love airplanes too. So anyway, she has been a real example to young people throughout the world. She attends a lot of used to attend the international conferences. She very cleverly pointed out years ago, before Glasgow happened, which was, that was COP26, that we should give up on these these meetings that are sponsored by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sponsored by the United Nations. And she was saying what happened at Glasgow was that all the fossil fuel lobbyists landed in on the conference, and there were hundreds of them, and they basically diluted or reduced the value of the meeting. And it got worse after Glasgow. So that the one that was held in Dubai, you had to hold your nose for that one, was hosted by the Minister of Petroleum of the United Arab Emirates. That was the host for the climate conference in Dubai. That it just proved Greta right. She said, forget about these. The fossil fuel industry has hijacked the climate conference. And that is so true. It gets worse every year. I think in Glasgow, there were 600 lobbyists. In Dubai, there were like close to 1,000. And this shows you what are trends in population. And I should point out that one of my criteria for a good environmental science or environmental studies textbook is the structure of the chapters. Coffee break. So if chapter 1 in the textbook is human population, we actually got a bunch of these years ago, before we even had the Allied Health and Science building. And all the publishers sent us their version of Environmental Science 1. And that included Cengage and Springer and Norton and McGraw-Hill and Pearson. So we stacked them all up and started going through one by one. And if the book had chapter 1, human population, next, I rejected every textbook that had human population as chapter 1. And the reason you'll see during the course of this course is that it harkens to the Achilles heel, if you will, of environmentalism, which is Malthusianism. And it has been with the environmental movement from the very beginning, and it's not going to go away, even though it's not scientific. It's 100% ideological. It's toxic to your brain. And it defines the problem wrongly, and therefore it begs for what's the solution. I had a student at UC Berkeley when I taught an upper division course there in the geography department, and we touched on the issue of, the issue then was global poverty. And this student was a cynic, hardcore, and a hardcore libertarian. And so he wanted to, we were talking about his paper, which was ghastly. And his paper, he was unrepentant Malthusian. He said, no, there's too many people in the world. It's just a fact. It's too many people. And so I said, well, I forget his name, Jack. Too many poor people, too many rich people, too many white people. We mean too many people. Which ones are the ones that are too many? Too many people in India, too many people in New York City? Because presumably there's a solution. So I want to know which ones you think are redundant, so that I can beware or give them notice that you think they should go away. He doubled down. This is something I have found about people whose mentality leans to the right. In other words, rather than engage with the question I asked him, which people are redundant? If there's too many people in the world, which ones are redundant? He cowered from the question because it was a question that came from reasoning, and immediately said, we have to eliminate the world's poor. He provoked me with something, an atrocity. So I think we need to do conventional warfare and wipe out 1/3 of humanity because there's too many people. And the ones we should kill are the poor. So, well, you need a checkup from the neck up, but I'm not giving you an A in this course, and I don't respect your opinion whatsoever. I'm amazed that you would even pronounce it, but then again, that's your politics, right? You're obviously a racist, obviously, and I don't have time for that, so bye-bye. But there's people like that, and Paul Ehrlich, and well, the worst one, Garrett Hardin, who we'll hear about, is the worst. The one is completely in that category. We need to wipe out 1/3 of humanity if we're going to survive. And Garrett Hardin is still the most read essay in environmental studies in the United States is an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, written by Garrett Hardin. And it is unscientific, ahistorical, it's entirely wrong, but it's the bedrock for his misanthropy, which is 1/3 of humanity should die off or be killed. Here you're seeing the reality. This shows you what are the median fertility rates starting 1950 to 2050 for the population measured here in billions for the whole planet. So where we are right now, let's say we're right here somewhere. We're at this point at which there's a fork in the road. There's three forks in the road. Okay, so the scenarios are high fertility would mean nothing changes. It stays the same as it's been since 1970. Not only unlikely, but it's interesting that what they put for high fertility here has us reaching 10 billion people by 2050. And right now, I think we're really close to 8 billion. Um, so this would happen in the next 25 years. We would add another 2 billion to that to be at 10 billion. That has been revised a little bit by the United Nations Population Council that used to suggest that we would even reach 12 billion by the end of the century, something that even anti-Malthusians like me would say is not sustainable for the planet or for humans. Median fertility is the most likely one, statistically speaking, and trend-wise. That would have us reaching 9 billion people by 2050. And that is actually I think this is the higher end, is the 9 billion by 2050. The low end has us leveling off like in a couple of years. And then if anything, fertility declining after 2040 and going back toward 8 billion by the middle of the century, by 2050. This is known as the Japan scenario. And that is countries whose populations are shrinking rather than growing. And it's a trend. It's a growing trend throughout the world because of the lower slide, which is these are changes in the total fertility rate. It's known as the TFR, and it's measured in this case, they're saying children per woman. I've heard, live births per mother. This is a weird statistic because I don't know if you just look at the entire female population of a country and then look at the birth rate and then make one the factor of the other. But not all women choose to have babies. So this might be the usefulness of this statistic is still very significant. So let's just say, what does that have to offer here? What's the point? The point is that if you look at the least developed countries, that's the poor countries that student at Berkeley wanted to wipe out. They had a total fertility rate in 1970 of close to 7. I grew up with that because I grew up in Mexico City, and the fertility rate in Mexico was really high. I remember in the late 60s when we hosted the Olympics in 1968, my brother, who was really keen on statistics about Mexico, told me, do you realize that half the population of Mexico is under the age of 15? Like, what? Yeah. In the late 60s, half of the population of Mexico was under the age of 15. It's called a bottom-heavy demographic pyramid. And that meant that the fertility rate was really high. It was not 7, but it was maybe 6. That means, 6 kids per woman. Okay, today, the TFR for Mexico is the same as the United States in 1970s. It's reached what's called replacement rate. In other words, it's reached that magic number of 2. And that's happened in 50 years. It's phenomenal. As a decline in fertility, it is phenomenal. And it's also, in some ways, unexpected. But one of the factors that leads to declines in fertility is urbanization. When people move from rural areas, particularly impoverished rural areas, where it's a village and they're eking out an existence on subsistence crops, and life is precarious, there's a reason for large families. There's a logic to high fertility because the family's so vulnerable to infant mortality rates, natural disasters, hunger, starvation, malnutrition, you name it. When you move to a city, there's medical care. Ideally, there's water to drink, there's food to buy, and there's even school to put your kid in. And that's when you see people make the urban choice that it's easier to bring up 2 children and feed them and clothe them and educate them and keep them healthy than it is to bring up 7 children in the city. So the logic of the small family applies often when people move to the city, and the logic of the large family applies when people remain subsistence peasants in rural poverty. So the fact that today more human beings live in cities than ever before in the history of humanity, we have suddenly become an urban species. More people live in cities. So that's why you see all of these trends. Less developed regions, that's not the poorest, but you could say that Mexico in the 1960s was an LDC, a less developed country, sometimes referred to as the global south. It used to be referred to as the third world. There's all kinds of terminology that's used to define or describe those countries that are not rich, urban, industrial, like the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, that's or the G7 or the rich countries of the world. And so there are those countries where the average incomes are relatively low. And that's also changing radically. A lot of countries that we used to think were poor are not poor anymore. China has reached incredible levels of affluence. And with that, also a real decline in fertility. Now, in China, it was coercive. It was the one and two child policies of the state that brought them toward replacement rate. So now the fertility rates in China are below replacement, and that's actually worrying them because they think, oh my God, we're going to be like Japan. You know, in a couple of decades, the average age will be senior, people be in their 60s. So it's interesting that what we used to worry about overpopulation, which is too many people, and we'll look at that when we do the population chapter at the end of this week. But when you look at so-called overpopulation, that's a challenge for any government because if half your population is under the age of 15, you better educate them if you want a future. And where do you come up with the money to educate half of your population K through 12, or for that matter, K through 9? It's a real daunting challenge for a lot of countries to do. The opposite end is our population shrinking. We don't have enough people in the labor force. Think Japan. And so either we need to make everything a robot, or we need to welcome immigrants. So the United States has avoided the Japan problem because until yesterday, we always welcomed immigrants. We meaning the ethos of the United States when it was a nation of immigrants. And just about everybody that you could run into could tell you what their heritage was, you know, Irish, or Polish, or Italian, or for that matter, you know, African origin or Asian origin. In other words, you can see that right here in Los Angeles, one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the country. Believe it or not, there are 43 officially recognized languages in Los Angeles County. So we're in that sense, for us, it's old hat. Yeah, my neighbor is Armenian and my other neighbor is Japanese and my other neighbor is from Oaxaca. And if you live in San Fernando Valley, that would not be unusual at all. But what it's done is it brings young people who are already somewhat educated. They're healthy because that's how they got here. People don't arrive here on crutches, and immediately ready to work. Right now, we do have labor shortages in certain key sectors. It's sort of come up as, of course, incredibly over 200,000 jobs were created last month. But there are still businesses telling you they can't find the workers, particularly semi-skilled and skilled workers. And that's where community colleges come in. So one of the conundrums, paradoxes for us right now is that enrollment in community college is dropping at a time when demand for more skilled labor is increasing. And one of the ways to increase skills if you're entering certain kinds of labor markets is through CTE programs in community colleges. Well, just one example, electric cars have taken over, meaning that they're cheaper now. There's incentives to buy them. People do buy them, and they're better. They get longer range. Maybe they won't blow up anymore. Meaning that who's going to fix your electric car? I mean, my mechanic does internal combustion engines, and the electric cars are complicated. They have, you know, some of them are actually run by 4 individual motors. You have to learn electrical car repair. Now, right now, I think only Pierce and I think Trade Tech do electric car maintenance and repair. But if you, all you need to do is own one and realize getting it fixed, you know, there's a lot of demand for people. So that's an example I'm giving. We have a shortage in the labor market for skilled workers that fix electric cars, and we have programs at community college that train workers to enter that job market, which, by the way, is usually pretty well paid that's really considered skilled labor. More developed regions in the world went from their total fertility rate in 1950 that was slightly below 3 to where they are today, below replacement. So here's replacement, 2, and that's the world and the less developed countries. Here's above replacement, 2.5, and that's the least developed countries. And here's the below replacement for the more developed regions. This is the conundrum of Western Europe and Japan. So the United States, quote unquote, solves this problem by immigration. We've been below replacement rate since 1970. In other words, the TFR in the United States has been like 1.7 or 1.8 for decades. So we should, by all measures, be in a Japan problem. It's not enough people go around, but we solved that problem with immigration, and that's why I'm quite despondent. I don't know what the right word is at what Biden has done to accommodate the conservatives in the Congress in drafting the new immigration rules that have been drawn up. They were drawn up to please harsh critics. They weren't drawn up to please immigration rights groups, and they've reduced the asylum requests. Now, the reason is that there have been huge waves of immigrants from what they call what do they call it? Well, the triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, through Mexico, and then up to the typically Texas border towns where they wait to walk across the border and request political asylum. So it's taxed the system. There aren't enough immigration judges to adjudicate cases. So the backlog is years long. So I understand why Biden thought we got to shut off the tap because we don't have the institutional capacity to process all of these claims. But it did send a signal that the Democrats are willing to, in a sense, move away from their historical position of being very strongly pro-immigrant. And it's accommodated the increased anti-immigrant attitudes in the Republican Party, which, thanks to Trump, become somewhat, how should I say, pervasive, where it's difficult for a Republican to have a different point of view from Donald Trump. In a sense, he destroyed the Republican Party, which is unfortunate because obviously, in a real functioning democracy, you need political parties that are resilient, that represent somebody, and that advance policies that at least can be debated. So I feel bad for people who are Republicans today because their party's been hijacked by a rather large orange thing. And these are the kinds of examples, you could say, of where you might find certain problems and solutions. In recent years, much of the world has been seen dramatic progress in healthcare, education, and major challenges include slowing biodiversity loss, as this Amazon gold mine, and increasing access to renewable energy. And these are solar panel installers. By the way, Trade Tech has a program in solar panel installation. And some buildings are like in the big warehouses of, if you go out toward San Bernardino, toward Ontario, there's huge areas of warehouses. It's kind of the warehouse capital of the world. So I'm thinking of, Azusa all the way to San Bernardino. And some of them are getting it that they can put solar panels on those enormous roofs and not only not have to pay a light bill, but maybe even get paid by the utility for what they contribute to the grid from their very productive solar panels. Now, this one we'll get to talk about when we talk about renewable energy, because we've been dealt a major setback in the state of California by the California Public Utilities Commission, which I have friends that work for the CPUC. I have friends that work with the CPUC, and I also have friends that are really keen on renewable energy. My renewable energy friends tell me the Public Utilities Commission killed rooftop solar in California in one fell swoop, in one decision. And the LA Times said that, yes, that decision, which ended the subsidy for rooftop solar, destroyed 17,000 jobs in California. In other words, there were 17,000 people like these guys that are both roofers, they have to not damage roofs, and they're engineers, they're electrical engineers. So they're installing rooftop solar. No more No more incentives, no more tax breaks, no more subsidies. Bye-bye rooftop solar. It's crazy. But I think the CPUC is what I would call a captive agency, meaning the agency is now dominated by the very industries it's supposed to regulate. That has happened to the EPA, it's happened to the FDA, it's happened to USDA. A lot of regulatory agencies have become so infected by the industries that they're regulating that they're incapable of meeting their mission. And we've been dealt three gut blows by the California Public Utilities Commission in the last year, and I'm still reeling from them. So that's why I have this uncharitable view that Gavin Newsom stacked that commission with people who maybe they're going to do what he wants them to do, but they're also doing what the industry wants them to do. Um, so yes, education for children is a key variable in fertility decline. The more years of school young girls and women get in countries, the more likely they are to make their own fertility decisions. It sounds axiomatic, but you'd have to live in a different, more traditional, confining culture to see to what extent women don't have the choices that we here had until what, a couple of years ago, when the Supreme Court decided that they would get rid of Roe v. Wade and destroy women's right to have an abortion. And now there are many, 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 many states that have gotten the green light from the Supreme Court, and they're implementing bans on abortion, different kinds of bans, in terms of weeks, months, whatever it is, but they're effective. In some cases, there's no place to get an abortion within a state. So what had been really perceived as the right of women to make their own decisions regarding their own bodies was taken away by an ultra right-wing Supreme Court. So we've lost what we always thought that would not go away: a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to end her pregnancy. And in many countries in the world where women are actually under pressure, usually from their in-laws, to produce a son. That's very big in India, and it used to be very big in China until the Mao period. So you're under pressure to have a son, and you have another daughter, and so you have 5 babies instead of 2. And it was your in-laws that well, in India you have this horrible thing called bride burning, and that is if the woman is not delivering a son, the in-laws will literally throw kerosene all over her and set her on fire. There are burn wards in India of young women who've been burnt by their in-laws or maybe even their own husbands because they didn't produce a son. So when we talk about reproductive choice, it's not an abstraction. It's not a theory. It's a physical, material fact. And I think it's terrible that we allowed, well, if he comes back, we're going to be really sorry, but Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump and Leonard Leo, or Leo Leonard, whatever his name is, stacked the federal benches and they stacked the Supreme Court. All of the people who testified during their confirmation hearings that are now sitting on the court, all of them said that Roe v. Wade was set law, was precedent, that it couldn't be undone. Gorsuch said it, Comey Bryant said it, Kavanaugh said it, Alito said it. They lied. They lied under oath, and that now they're sitting on this. They knew they said, "Oh no, we got to get rid of Roe v. Wade." They wouldn't be confirmed, so they lied. They got confirmed, and then they went and got rid of Roe v. Wade, the very thing that was the main concern of people on the committee interviewing them. It's a dark time right now politically in this country, and we better hurry up and smell the coffee. So there's healthcare. There is these kids would all have school uniforms. Well, the school I went to in Mexico, we had school uniforms with the little shield of the school. And so it was a very British education I had. And these kids could be in any country in Africa that's either francophone, meaning the colonial language is French, or the colonial language is English. Oh, it's English. I'm seeing the signage in the background. And so they're getting a very proper proper British education, like the one I got when I was a little kid. And there is the destruction of the Amazon with of course the dredging. In this case, they're probably looking for gold. I'm judging by this machine here. Um, so what do we get from natural systems that are free but essential to our survival? So in this case, what it's showing you are ecosystem services that we depend on and are in many ways invisible, like the fact that decomposition and nutrient recycling happen, so basically creating soil. This is the living part of soil eventually. Carbon capture, and that is that plants absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen as a waste product. Photosynthesis, which adds to the vegetative cover of the earth. The only process that consumes CO2 and produces oxygen as a waste product is photosynthesis. Um, and then, of course, because it's fuel, then this very large herbivore. So herbivore is any animal that depends on vegetation, on primary production for its fuel source. So the first order consumer, since these are all producers, the first order consumer is the herbivore. And it can be a tiny little herbivore like a cricket, and it can be a cow. The main thing is its diet is plants. The second order consumer is the first order carnivore, and that would be an animal that eats other animals. Water purification by streams and soil bacteria, and temperature regulation. So these are just examples. Okay. This is an interesting diagram. It's a calculated planetary boundaries, and it has some thresholds beyond which irreversible change is likely. Green shading represents safe ranges. Yellow represents a zone of increasing risk. Red wedges represent factors exceeding the boundaries. This was produced by Will Steffen, Catherine Richardson, Jonna Rugstrom in 2015, Planetary Boundaries Guiding Human Development on a Changing Planet. And this was published in Science Magazine in January of 2015. It's very useful when people find visual ways of representing quantitative data because it's a lot easier to understand than a table with a bunch of numbers on it. So the green is the safe zone. So which are the ones that are the red ones? The rate of extinction right now is so high that it approaches what you could call a mass extinction. And there've only been 5 mass extinctions on Earth. So if we're in the 6th one, it'll be because we have wiped out 50% of the genera, which is the plural for genus, on the planet. That, in a sense, defines a mass extinction. And it's not that we're that close, but the speed with which species are going extinct makes it so we are that close. So that's why this one's red. And then you have biogeochemical flows, and this is for nitrogen and phosphorus that are also in the red, meaning that we're adding way too much these as interruptions of the biogeochemical cycles, and nitrogen as fertilizer has a big role in contaminating water bodies, whether they're marine water bodies or freshwater lakes or what have you. Ocean acidification, it's getting into the yellow. Atmospheric aerosol loading. This is an interesting point because yesterday I heard a very interesting news story about wildfires in California and firefighters. And the issue was, why do people exhibit long-term, I'll just say, debilitating effects long after they survived a wildfire? And the finding, of course, the culprits is tiny particulate matter that lodges in the lungs and stays there, and then it's responsible for all kinds of respiratory, even depending on the size of the particulate matter. Some of it is so small that it actually gets into your bloodstream. That would be anything that's less than 2 microns of PM. PM is typically the smallest that is measured or quantified is 2.5 microns, and then 5 microns, and then 10. 10 microns is the diameter of a healthy strand of black hair. So if you had a what do you call it, electron microscope, and you looked at a cross section of very nice thick hair, it's 10 microns across. So imagine dividing that several times to get something that's much smaller. Stratospheric ozone depletion. This one's been moving in fits and starts, but unlike some of these other problems, it really only has one culprit. there's one compound. They're known as chlorofluorocarbons, and they are responsible for the depletion um, of of excuse me, of the ozone layer in the lower stratosphere. Um, Novel entities, I think by that they mean invasive species. I haven't ever seen that term before, novel entities. Okay. Um, okay, so this is an insert. One of the things they do in this book, and it's not going to make it bigger. No, it's not. Is in every chapter they have these inserts which combine, in this case, about 10 different points that have to do with how you would define sustainability. What does it have to do with environmental science? Well, a lot, because it's something you quantify, but there's components of sustainability that have to be based on science and data and facts. There are also components of sustainability that have to deal with ethics and law and economics. So that as our goal involves all of these different disciplines and knowledge bases. But look at the contrast. This is probably a poor family that could be, it doesn't say where, does it? Let's see. Because it could be Pakistan. When there was a huge monsoon flooding in Pakistan a couple of years ago, yeah, it flooded 30% of the country. I don't know if consult maps. Pakistan is a big country. It's not a tiny little country. 30% of it underwater for months on end. They lost schools, roads, bridges, hospitals, animals, people, crops. It's amazing the destruction. And it cost Pakistan billions and billions of dollars, and to which there was supposed to be an international fund for dealing with climate-induced disasters at countries that don't have large treasuries. I don't know how much was actually delivered to Pakistan to address this disaster, but to give you an idea, Pakistan produces less than 1% of the greenhouse gases that are responsible for the climate crisis. So in other words, they aren't, if you want to look at it, they aren't the guilty party. They didn't create the problem, and yet they're getting the brunt of it. This is not unusual. The countries of what we could call the global south, that is, poor countries that are maybe within the tropics, they get the brunt of climate-induced changes, weather changes, flooding, long drought, et cetera, et cetera. This is your typical sort of American monster suburban house, which I've always wondered. I mean, this was just over the top. They got 2 SUVs, every bicycle in the world. Watch out. We have a word in Peru for something that's in poor taste. I think this is poor taste, but that's just me. It's huachafo. Yes, it's over the top. It's what we call a monster house, meaning the house is too big for the needs of the family. It's just monstrously huge. What does draw my attention, though, is these steps, because they don't really match the house that well. Maybe they do, but there's building codes in Canada that require these kinds of stairs. So this could actually be a suburban view in Canada. Such a sleuth. I'm such a sleuth. Reducing resource consumption, population growth. It doesn't say. But this standard of living cannot be sustained. And yet, when you look at American foreign policy and American economic policy, it's based on the success of the United States, not on the needs of Pakistan. It's based on the success of the United States. We're basically telling the rest of the world, hey, you should be like us. Isn't this really a nice place to live? And it can't be reproduced. The claim on natural resources exerted by the United States, which is less than 4% of the world's population, less than 4% of the world's population, is that we consume over 25% of the world's crude petroleum. That's just one measure. One statistic had it that we were absorbing about 60% of the world's trade in natural resources. But I think that statistic was produced in the late 1980s, before China became a major consumer of natural resources. But in other words, there's no comparison. We should not be the standard for where economies want to go. And yet, we not only do we say we're the standard, but we'll make sure. I mean, if you try to break away from what we define as freedom, meaning capitalism, will do nasty things to you, like sanctions, and we'll seize your bank accounts, we'll arrest your leadership. And look at what the United States has done to Cuba. What did Cuba ever do to the United States? I'm hard pressed to find, and yet we have a stranglehold on Cuba that's been there for over 50 years. That is mainly responsible for the bad economic situation in Cuba, which is, by the way, another country that is leaking immigrants to the Texas border, as is Venezuela. So both those countries, which tried in some ways to break away from the U.S. grip on what constitutes proper political economy, have both been punished for that, and they're paying the price for it. In other words, we don't tolerate pluralism when it comes to economic systems. We are absolutely monotheistic. It's either free market capitalism or hit the road, Jack. This is a nice little scene of how cities can become more livable. And it's obviously it's in a nice, probably a European country. Um, Sustainable cities are key. But the takeaway from this image isn't so much where do they take the picture, as much as that some cities just lend themselves to pedestrian traffic, to, in a sense, a slower, quieter pace. This street probably used to be a street with parked cars and loud motorcycles. Then they decided through urban design to design something that was going to be pedestrian friendly, and therefore the cafe look. This helped a whole lot during the pandemic when a lot of restaurants were allowed to set up shop on the sidewalk because people didn't want to go indoors. In New York, it kind of stuck. And I've seen in some places in LA, I don't know how they've managed to, get permission from the city to keep their outdoor seating because people like it. The funny thing about cities is that when you make them nicer, people like them. And when it's all strip malls and stroads, as they're called, and shopping malls and freeways, eh. Um, we already saw this image. There is, did it say where it was? Disease, accents, respiratory, digestive, but it is pointing to the importance of vaccination. So if this kid is probably getting a polio vaccine because it's typically put in a sugar cube, it's taken orally. It's not necessarily a subcutaneous or intramuscular, but it's easily dispensed. And in fact, there are a few horrible diseases that we thought we had gotten rid of, like smallpox, and measles and polio. But because of the anti-vax movement, which is surprisingly much bigger than I thought, people have stopped vaccinating their kids. Not only in advanced industrial countries, but in some developing countries, they add a whole layer to the paranoia. Well, the doctors aren't real doctors. The vaccines aren't vaccines. And a lot of crazy religious groups in developing countries discourage people from having their kids vaccinated. And I have my vaccine book with me. I've been inoculated against everything from pertussis, which is whooping cough, measles. Finally, I got measles when I was a little kid because there was no vaccine. Um, and so I think it's tragic that people have this crazy stuff that, that's the problem with the internet. I read it on the internet. You read it on the Telegraph. What does that mean? And so it's not true. It's not true that vaccines cause autism in children, as Robert Kennedy wants everyone to believe. And I bet you that Robert Kennedy is fully inoculated. I bet you that kid grew up with all of the shots: pertussis, which is whooping cough, measles, tetanus. Um, I'm sure, he's just a professional hypocrite. This is a clear cut, combining deforestation, protecting biodiversity. So in this case, it isn't clear cut. Let me rephrase that, because notice that some trees are still standing and they're even marked. So here they're doing some kind of selective logging to allow the remaining trees to keep the forest as a forest. And then let's see what it says. Other key zones of biodiversity include coral reefs, wetlands. Okay, it's just examples of biodiversity habitats. Where is this picture from? Here, Mr. Cunningham and Mrs. Cunningham. I have no idea where this picture's from. We're back. Combating desertification. And this is a problem when you aren't flooded. is prolonged drought. And there are regions in East Africa that have been experiencing drought for almost 10 years. And then they got the brunt of incredible flooding. In Kenya, they lost several dams. The flooding is extensive through Kenya, and they've just come out of a 4 or 5 year drought. So that is a symptom of climate change, is not just more extreme weather, but that the extremes have these periods, so it's dry as a bone for years. The way we've experienced in the Southwest, a prolonged drought that, despite the rains we've had this year in California, doesn't mean that the Colorado River Basin has been replenished in any way. All you have to do is look at the bathtub ring behind the dams, the Hoover Dam. You see that about 40% of the water is gone. So are we seeing climate-induced aridification of the West, or are we experiencing a long drought? And those are two different things. Droughts have a beginning, a middle, and an end, whereas increased aridification does not. It means that you're reverting to desert, and it's going to stay that way. So that is one of the big fears of lack of rainfall in the southwestern United States. This farmer is using animal traction, which is good for the plants. It's hard work. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost its imports of both farm machines and diesel fuel for the machines. So they went back to animal traction. A lot of farmers still remembered when they had oxen, and they went and put the oxen on the field and started plowing with oxen. And all because we have an embargo on Cuba, and they're not allowed to import farm machinery or diesel fuel from the United States. They're only 90 miles away from Florida Keys. It's when I wrote Biden a real long letter about that. Okay, these are known as the Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations. In this case, you're seeing, I think, all 17 of them. They do have these nice little icons that make them memorable, and they have these bright colors. So often you'll see more and more of these crop up. For example, I showed you our web page, and the homepage on our web page has those of these Sustainable Development Goals that our seminar guest was lecturing about. It combines, social goals with development goals. So sustainable development is understood as not just being a technical question of here, let's define what plant biodiversity is by counting the number of plants and so on. Sustainable development implies that you're addressing a problem, and that then you're going to solve that problem through all kinds of innovations and interventions. But what exacerbates or even makes more difficult any success is long-lasting social issues like poverty. 2 billion people of the 8 billion people on the planet live in abject poverty, meaning they live hand to mouth. And that means that there's a good chunk of humanity that is hungry. And it's not hungry because there's too many people. If anything, you'll see when we get to that chapter, we overproduce food on Earth tremendously. Half the food we buy in the United States, or that we produce, doesn't reach your mouth. It gets lost, wasted, spoiled, thrown out. And that includes my refrigerator. So, from the field to the landfill, I'm guilty of buying too much food that I then realize, oh my God, the broccoli went bad. I forgot all about it. So we overproduce food, and we waste anywhere from 40 to 50%. So no, hunger and malnutrition are not the consequence of overpopulation. They are the consequence of really bad agricultural policy, and for that matter, insufficient attention to the problems, nutritional needs of poor people and their children. Good health, well-being, quality education, and gender equality. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 are all social goals. And then you get to the next rung. 6 is clean water, 7, affordable and clean energy, decent work, innovation in infrastructure, reduced inequalities, which is kind of related to number 1, and sustainable cities and communities. So you'll see in Los Angeles, for example, LA County will put which one of these goals they're addressing on that dashboard. So it's become a very useful infomercial, I don't know what to call it, infographic, to break down what are the constituents of what you could call sustainable development. Now, they are produced by the United Nations. So one of the drawbacks, if you will, is that the UN is a member organization. So it cannot endorse ideas that the membership doesn't endorse. So they're actually quite careful. For example, let's look at the last rung, responsible consumption and production. It doesn't say reduce consumption, but it should say reduce consumption. But you can't say reduce consumption when you have 2 billion people that have nothing. So you can see the debates would go on in the UN about what can we say safely that doesn't contradict another of the goals. Climate action, number 13, and that could be legal, social, engineering. I mean, climate action covers everything from teaching climate literacy in schools to switching traction from internal combustion engines to electric. All of those things are, in a sense, climate actions. Life below water, number 14. So that covers marine and freshwater systems. Life on land is terrestrial systems. And then number 16, peace, justice, strong institutions, which is sort of related to 11, to 10 and 11. And then finally, partnerships for the goals, number 17. So often the UN is criticized for this approach to things, that it's sanitized or made safe by not offending anybody. In other words, who could be for increased inequality? I won't tell you who is for that. And this is a scene in, it doesn't tell you. With got an opposite, we're better. The very poor are often forced to live in degraded, unproductive areas where they have little access to sufficient clean water, diet, medical care, and other essentials for humane existence. So this little boy is taking care of these sheep and goats. In the background, I think there are cattle, possibly. And it's not unusual for pastoral people, for rural people in the global south, for children to have tasks, for children to be economically valuable. And that's one of the logics of the large family for rural people in the global south, is that children contribute to the family. They aren't just consumers. The older sister will take care of the baby when mom is out in the field. So that is one of the conundrums, or one of the factors that contributes to relatively high fertility rates among the rural poor in the global south. But what's interesting about children producing is that in some countries, for example, in wet rice cultures like Java, where rice is transplanted, so children do a lot of rice transplanting. By the time a kid is about 11 or 12 years old in the wet rice culture of Java, they've paid for themselves, which is astounding. I don't know if we ever pay for ourselves. And then by the time the kid is 15 or 16, they've paid for themselves and a sibling, just by the labor that they contribute, either at the family level or even, for that matter, off-farm labor. I mean, children in the global south do work. You find a lot of things that we treasure, so are made by children. Those famous, carpets from Iran, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, it's mined by 10-year-olds. Chocolate, cacao beans being harvested in Ghana, harvested by children. So there's a lot of child labor in the supply stream that we don't like to think about, but it's a fact. These kids aren't going to school, they're working to support their families. And this shows you quality of life indicators, starting with the most common one, which is GDP per person, gross domestic product, divided by the population. And then there's the poverty index, life expectancy. These are all indicators of what would constitute a good quality of life. So the two columns are the least developed countries, that's actually the poorest of the poor, and the most developed countries, and that would be the G7 or the OECD. And so you can see the difference in income. Most developed countries, the average income per person is $40,000, $41,000 per year. And in the global south, in a very poor country, it's $615 per year. Um, this is assuming that in most developed countries, you have a zero poverty index. I don't know where they get that from because I don't know any advanced industrial country that doesn't have poor people. I mean, there's homeless people in Paris, there's homeless people in Stockholm, there's homeless people in London, and they're poor. So how they came up with that, I don't know. I think the population of homeless people in LA County, as the last count, has grown to close to 75,000. And it's interesting how many of those are actually minors. They're kids. Life expectancy, quite a difference. You can see adult literacy. So in the least developed countries, it's about 1/3 of the population can read and write. Girls entering primary education. So it's only 10% in the least developed countries, and it's 95% in the more developed countries. And then you have this big difference in fertility. Yes, below replacement in the United States, Canada, Western Europe at 1.3, and way above the highest. This is, I think, a bit high, but they're 0.6, as a TFR for the least developed countries. That would be mainly in the African continent, and I think that there's really a handful of African countries that have a TFR that approaches 7. Most of them are below that. But when you look at the impact of dislocation and war and everything else that you can imagine going on in the African continent, particularly right now in the Sudan, there's a reason then why people choose to have large families. It's often a response to a trauma like war and disease and being wiped out the way Darfur is being wiped out. It's almost, you want to, in a sense, correct for the trauma by bringing life back to the world. So having a kid is not a bad thing. And yet I hear nice, educated Americans saying all the time, how could you possibly have a kid in this world? Don't you know you're just adding to the population problem? As if kids were horrible, right? But no, we're adding to the population problem by not having a kid, because then what's going to happen to the United States, particularly if we shut off the tap of immigration, is that our average age will get older and older and older. When I lived in San Francisco, I was surprised that it's a city with very few children. It's full of young adults, but it skews the demographics so that when I was living in San Francisco, the median age was 35. I think now it's even higher than that. But it was one of the highest in the United States. Um, so I don't know where it is now. Infant mortality, you can see, is very big in the global south. Improved sanitation, improved water. See, what they're claiming here for advanced industrial countries, I think is just not true. Improved water, 100%? Really? Flint, Michigan? PFAS? Really? This isn't true. Improved sanitation? Yeah, no. And then carbon dioxide per capita. And notice that it's 11 tons per person per year in an advanced industrial country, and it's 0.3 for people in the least developed countries. And yet these folks are paying the bill for the greenhouse gas emissions of these folks. This shows you what is the Human Development Index that the United Nations uses instead of GDP per capita. Values near 1 represent strong health, education, and quality of life indicators. And so the HDI is an alternative to GDP per capita. It does use a lot of the same social indicators that any economic model, for example, the World Bank might use. So it isn't exactly a solution to how do you measure well-being or progress or would you say a thriving population, but it's better than GDP per capita. GDP per capita it's just a number. It rarely reflects what you see on the ground. But you can see that one of the poorest countries in the Arab world is Yemen, right here. One of the richest countries on planet Earth is Saudi Arabia, right here. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, another super rich country, have been at war with Yemen for years and years and years. The Saudis using weaponry purchased by the United States, from the United States. And they bomb hospitals, schools, cities. It's relentless. And for some reason, nobody gives. Because Yemen has no oil. But why we let the richest countries in the Arabian Peninsula go to war with the poorest country in the Arab world is astounding to me, because no one even brings it up. just like we don't bring up Sudan, in Darfur, where that is a genocidal war. They are going after a particular group of people and killing them all. Um, there's like crickets on that one. This map is out of date. Sudan divided into two Sudans. There's now Southern Sudan that happened after their civil war, so that it's no longer the largest country in Africa. I think the Democratic Republic of Congo would now be would be the largest country on the African continent. So you can see that Africa pays a really high price when it comes to economic development, and the reason being that there's probably no region on Earth that has been more run over by European colonialism than the African continent, at least sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the Saharan countries, the Maghreb, the Mashrek, but south of that is typically referred to as sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the exception of Botswana and South Africa, they are the poorest countries in the world. But with the exception of Ethiopia, all of these were colonies of either France, Portugal, Britain at some point. It's been much harder for them to emerge from colonialism than it was for Latin America. Latin America breaks free from Spain and Portugal in the 19th century. Most of these African countries only got their independence after 1961. So they haven't even been independent countries for that long. So it's a major challenge to how do you develop economically when the boundaries of your country were actually created in a conference in Berlin. That's the fact. That's how Africa got carved up by Germany, France, Portugal, Britain, Spain. All the powers went. They cut up Africa and said, "This one's for you." So this Kenya went to England, and Tanzania, then Tanganyika went to Germany. It's amazing the footprint of colonialism on the world. So here what you see is Cancer Alley. This is a region near New Orleans. Actually, it's Baton Rouge that finally the EPA is looking into. The fossil fuel industry basically owns Louisiana. The children in school get textbooks written by oil companies touting the great oil and gas resources of Louisiana. So Cancer Alley is a region with incredibly high cancer rates, and this is what you might call a epidemiological map, meaning that in this case, actually, what it's mapping is the chemical industries. That's the circles, and then the colored regions is the percent of the population that's African American or Black, and the correlation between the presence of these chemical industries and the cancer rates among the Black population of this region it's actually all on the Mississippi River. So they have fought tooth and nail. They're still fighting. The EPA gave some regulation on Cancer Alley, and their state government said no. Some southern states think they won the Civil War. Louisiana seems to be one of those, where they balk at any federal directive when it comes to regulations and laws. They just say no. I don't know how we're going to deal with that because it's become a new thing of defying the Supreme Court. Well, not that it doesn't need defiance, but defying federal agencies in southern states and just saying they're doubling down on their defiance. Saying, what are you going to do about it? Land troops. So this is in Canada, they refer to the indigenous population, native population, as the First Nations. So you might often see that in some marches, particularly if the tribal groups are Canadian, which I think is a very, very useful term to refer to them as First Nations. It doesn't ethnicize them. It does give them credit for being here first. Right? So, and Canada does have in their constitution a whole lot of measures that defend the rights of First Nations and their claims either on land or resources. It's often litigated in Canada, but it is cemented into their constitution. They have a relatively large First Nations population compared to the U.S. lower 48 states, excluding Alaska and Hawaii. So these marches, they used to be really, really, really big, but today they're much more precise. You might find a march because they're opposing a specific pipeline, or they're opposing the commissioning of a nuclear reactor, or they're protesting the diversion of fresh water, or they're protecting water supplies, what are called the water keepers. So it's not as general as save the earth, save Mother Earth, even though that's what the sign says. Sometimes these are actually very, very specific. So notice this sign says tar sands. That is the in Canada and Alberta. That is how Canada says that they have oil reserves that rival Saudi Arabia. They might, but it's in tar. It's in sand. It's not bubbly black gold. It's not oil in that sense. You have to take the oil out of the sand. It's the environmental cost is huge. So these folks are opposed to the tar sands in Alberta, and here's somebody who's opposed to the pipelines, which carry the then semi-crude tar sand oil to refineries in Port Arthur, Texas, and places where it's going to be refined into gasoline. So that is a very interesting emergent. Unfortunately, the media doesn't pay attention to the fact that a lot of these marches are not just, they'll say, environmentalist march today, on climate. And if they had been to the march, they'd say, actually, environmentalists marched today to oppose tar sands in Alberta and building pipelines. Mainstream media loves to steal from contestant movements, particularly if they are contestant movements from the lower echelons of society, what they want, how they're and how they articulate it. And they often don't even interview the people that they're reporting about. Sorry, I used to be a journalist, and I watched how ABC and NBC and CNN and New York Times, how they roll. These folks are doing something that everybody finds interesting. I was surprised. I went to a climate meeting at Mount SAC, was it? Which is really a big community college. And a lot of students were doing marine biology. So that is what, these folks aren't doing this in Malibu, but if you've been to Malibu, you know that you can do this there. In this case, they're looking at a shore where there's a lot of seagrass or even seaweed that as the tide has retreated, it's exposed. So they're doing this standard scientific method of using a very clearly defined this is not a transect as much as it is a sampling. So they'll put this little white square where the water is 4 inches deep. They'll put it where it's 1 inch deep. They'll put it where there's lots of seaweed, put it where there's not a lot of seaweed. In other words, the scientific method requires that you get as much data as you possibly can from all the different sampling opportunities you have in one place. And that helps you make sense of the data in a way that's useful. So if they only went there and only took data from this little square and not the rest of it, then who knows how useful their findings would be. But you can do this in the tide pools in Malibu, and there's even docents from the state parks that take kids on when the tide is low into the tide pools so they can see how interesting intertidal habitats are. So the scientific method really looks somewhat like this. And that, in this case, they've really made it a lot simpler, but why not? Identifying a question. I think that usually the first step would be observation, because humans are keen observers and they love to watch things for long periods of time. Look at how much humans have spent looking at the stars in the sky and finding all the patterns, like, oh, that one comes around every few months. Which ones are bigger? Which ones are closer? And we've mapped the heavens. We've named them all, every galaxy, every cluster. And then we built telescopes to help us see deeper into space. So yeah, we love to observe. And so observation is something all humans do, regardless of where they are in history. And from those observations, then we do the normal inquisitive thing. We ask questions. And it's any human is capable of observing and asking questions. So to go from that into an explanation or a volunteer an answer to the question, then now it's falling more into the formal scientific method that dominates Western science and Western philosophy, developed by the ancient Greeks. Maybe it's the Aristotelian method. But in this case, the testable hypothesis would be to venture an answer to the question by suggesting that an answer that can be examined or tested. So you test the hypothesis, Then you form the hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you collect the data, and you interpret the results. If the results don't really fit um, your testable hypothesis, then either you throw it out and start again, or you revise it, you refine it. In other words, it wasn't entirely wrong; it was somewhat wrong, and that process is very painstaking. It's very slow, but it is how the scientific method works. Now, unfortunately, and then finally, if you succeed, that is that you like your your work, you're satisfied with the results, you publish it in a paper, in a peer-reviewed paper. So all scientific papers begin with what are the previous studies of what I'm writing about. It's called the literature review section. My students in Environmental Science 22 learn all about scientific papers. We spend the entire semester, they spend the entire semester on one scientific paper that they adopt. But we learn a whole lot about how they're written, how they're structured, how they're revised. And so here you have a simplified view of the scientific method. For example, it only has 6 steps here, and I think there might be 7 or 8. But it gives you the idea. If more people understood the scientific method, we wouldn't get such hokey takes on science that you get from people like Robert Kennedy. Um, he has a law degree, but I don't know what he has for a brain. I understand there's a worm in his brain. I don't know if you saw that, but there's a dead worm in his brain. Like, I'm not kidding. And so maybe that explains why he's Michigas. But if he understood vaccines and he understood the scientific method behind vaccines, and that vaccines have been with us for a long time. I mean, Ben Franklin inoculated himself against smallpox, I think, and neglected to inoculate his nephew, who ended up dying. And Ben Franklin writes in his diaries or his memoirs that's one of the most regrettable things he did in his life was to not inoculate his nephew for the disease that he had been inoculated for. And by the way, what's interesting about smallpox is that the inoculation itself, the vaccine, if you will, the way of vaccinating a person, this is way back in the 1700s, right? So they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have chemistry labs, but they had a very interesting relationship with sort of trial and error and knowledge that's passed down generation to generation. Turns out that the very first successful vaccinations against smallpox were actually done in Africa by pastoral people who applied a poultice of the disease on the skin of a person who would then be exposed to a very low dose of the virus and would build their immunities against it and then be effectively inoculated against it. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know if you've seen to what extent, once again, observation. Humans observing what either other animals do or what effect plants have. There's a wonderful image. It's an orangutan, I believe, in Indonesia. They had a wound on his face, like a really, all the skin under the eye was exposed. There was no skin there. And the orangutan goes out and finds a plant and applies the plant to the wound. I swear to God, it's big news like last month. And it's amazing. Now, the more people observe apes, the more we realize that their levels of intelligence and comprehension are far, far greater than we ever give them credit for. She's doing careful, repeated measurements, and well-formed hypotheses are essential for good science. And notice that it did say careful and repeated. So when you do come up with an experiment and with your results using the scientific method, you often have to go the rest of the way and carry the experiment out again and again and again. In a way, you want to fail. You want to find out where you're wrong before you even try to publish a paper. So it's not finding failure that then encourages the scientists to go ahead and publish their paper. But other scientists who maybe agree or don't agree with your hypothesis are also free to do the same experiments themselves because you've listed experiments in your science paper. You've described them. And so in that sense, you're inviting other scientists to imitate or to question your results by carrying out the same experiments. This did happen, and we talked about this in Environmental Science 22. There have been several hoaxes in the world of scientific research. that are unfortunate. And one of them was called cold fusion. It came out in, I think, the 1990s. Two scientists swore that they had obtained the fusion of elements on a lab table, no reactor, just in a kind of beaker on a lab table. And it got published. They were on the cover of what was then really, really popular news weeklies, Time, Newsweek, etc. They even, got money thrown at them. And then other scientists said, well, let's see if I can do it. And nobody could reproduce the results. So they said, this is not a valid paper. This is not a valid finding. We can't do what you did and get the same results. So that is why scientists have to publish their methods and their findings, because you really want other scientists to probe it to see if it's in fact correct. And that's why it's called peer review. Your paper is reviewed by people who actually either know your work or they know a lot about your subject material, that they're in a position to evaluate your work. And that's why the scientific method today is really a collective process rather than Archimedes getting into his bathtub. Well, this is one way to find out if anybody's awake. Okay, Archimedes, Greek philosopher, gets into his bathtub and has an epiphany. He has a realization that excites him so much that he jumps out of the bathtub and starts running through his village, stark naked, screaming one word in Greek that is also the motto of the state of California. Now, you can unmute yourself and tell me, what is that word? Either nobody knows or nobody's listening. Is everybody here? Oh, hmm.
Yes, we're here. We just don't know, maybe.
Yeah, you do. Okay. It's the state seal. It's interesting because it's San Francisco Bay and it has the big tall sail ships. And then in the foreground is, I guess, Lady Liberty sitting. She's in a kind of in a throne, and I forget what she's holding. And then to her, below her is a little bear, and then beneath that is a, how do you say, a motto, one word. And it's actually the name of the northwesternmost city of California.
Eur
Ah,
Eureka?
thank you. Thank you, Travis. Eureka in Greek means I found it. That's what Archimedes was so, he was so enthralled about. So that's the motto for California. It's almost like people have spent a lifetime looking for, the golden land, and here it is. I found it. It's California. This is the Human Development Index. It's just here exploring, how it's how you create visual representations of quantitative data. So in this case, they're using that same issue we looked at earlier, the HDI, and then they're showing you what I would see as it's called a histogram. It's like a bar graph, and all the bars touch each other, and that's, I think, when it's called a histogram. So it's a distribution of the Human Development Index, right? That's easier to see than a table with numbers. Let's see what the next one. Eureka! This is a scatter plot. This is what I use to calculate grades at the end of the semester. Excel will do a scatter plot of all the scores in the class, and then I look for what are called cohorts or clumped groups. So there's usually the A group, the B group, and the C group. And they're pretty easy. If it's a big class, they're very easy to see. If it's a small class, then better give them all A's. No. This one also shows a trend line. So in this particular scatter diagram, the Excel will do this. It will separate, like, for example, half of what is the median between all these dots, and it'll draw a line between one half and the other half. So these are all different ways of showing quantitative data that is something you can retain visually. We're much more, we remember images more than we do numbers. So this is mean carbon dioxide emissions measured in tons per capita. And then there's the HDI categories. That's the Human Development Index category. So low, medium, high, very high. And then you have the error bars. These little I-beams here, they usually have a floor and a ceiling. And it shows you that this value is within this floor and this ceiling. In other words, either it's within a margin of error or in terms of sampling, it's the median of all of the higher numbers. So you will often see this in a diagram where they're showing you one value, which is the height of the bar, and then there's this little I-beam that shows you where that is with relationship to the entire number. And lovely Yosemite, one of the most beautiful parks in the United States. It was the second park after Yellowstone, and it was created at the behest of John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, who were then good friends. And when it was turned into a park, then the native population that lived in the valley was evicted. And John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, was responsible for saying that the presence of people in a park was incompatible with the park. That's one of the schools of thought in the United States that's known as preservationism. So preservationism is keep it in a pristine condition, don't let humans alter anything at all. Whereas conservationism, that was Gifford Pinchot's philosophy, is you can use the resources in these areas wisely, meaning don't use them up, don't destroy the place, but you can use them. And so that has always been a division in the federal government policy toward public lands. Do we have a preservationist policy, that's national parks, or do we have a conservationist policy, and that's national forests? And the areas covered by national forests are far larger than the areas covered by national parks. Yosemite is a freak of nature because it's geologically fascinating. Way over there, you can see there's Half Dome. So these are granitic rock formations that are exposed to the elements because of weathering. So the weathering took away all the looser material and exposed these giant granite plutons, as they're called. But notice that the valley floor is full of trees. That is a result of the fact that it's a park. When native people lived here, they harvested some of the trees. And in fact, that was a good thing because then a fire couldn't just consume all the trees. It would run into gaps and the fire would stop. So today we're looking back at the way that native people managed their resources, their wildlands, vis-a-vis the way that we do with our modern philosophy of preservationism, and finding out that preservationism can backfire. If you don't let anything happen in this valley floor, there will be a fire someday because it's California, and it'll burn all the trees. And then you'll have zero forest on the valley floor. So today we're in California, we're trying to learn in the practice of what's called a controlled burn, trying to learn from the native population as to how they carried out controlled burns. In other words, a small fire today is a lot better than a huge fire tomorrow. So that is a practice that's done by the Forest Service and by CAL FIRE, selective burning or controlled burns, usually of the understory or the brush, the vegetation that's at the base of the trees. And it carries a fuel load. So if you remove that vegetation, then an advancing fire is going to run out of fuel. And that is the purpose of controlled burns and it's thinning the valley floor. So here are I mentioned three of these chaps already. There's Teddy Roosevelt, Mr. Outdoorsy, who created Yellowstone and then at the behest of Muir and Pinchot created Yosemite, the second national park. And these are controversial characters. Gifford Pinchot was a eugenicist, which is a philosophy that was really popular at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, based on a pseudo-scientific theory of white superiority called eugenics. And you can guess who really liked it, a certain little colonel or corporal in the German army with a little square mustache thought, eugenics, I like that. In fact, it would shock you how much of American Jim Crow laws and racial segregation laws and anti-miscegenation laws and were American. And Hitler, looking at how he's going to make Germany great again, incorporates them in Germany, including the philosophy of eugenics, that you could breed an Ubermensch, that you could breed a better human if you stopped lower people from breeding, right? So Pinchot, bless his heart, was a subscriber to that philosophy. He also founded the School of Forestry at Yale, which is one of the preeminent environmental schools in the country. but I don't think they named it after him. He and Muir were best buddies for a while. They used to walk the Sierra together, exploring and maybe naming things. Muir founded the Sierra Club, a preservationist, Pinchot, a conservationist. So Muir wanted to protect Hetch Hetchy, which is the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne River, directly north of Yosemite, which is the canyon of the Merced. um, there was a demand that they build a dam at Hetch Hetchy, which is the native word for that little narrow neck between the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne and the Central Valley. And San Francisco had had its earthquake. They needed water and they needed electricity. So they built a dam at Hetch Hetchy. Gifford Pinchot told John Muir, sorry, John, you can't just put a fence around everything and keep everybody out. You know, there's such a thing as people have needs. And San Francisco needs the water, they need the electricity. So it broke John Muir's heart, actually, because I walked that Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne many years ago when I was fit Jovic, and it is amazingly beautiful. It lacks the flatness of the valley floor of Yosemite, so it's steeper. You have to climb all the way to Tuolumne Meadows, and it has more waterfalls than Yosemite, a lot of wildlife, and it's not often. You don't find a lot of people the way you do. In Yosemite, you have to make reservations. The Grand Canyon of Tuolumne, you're on your own. And then Aldo Leopold, who wrote The Land Ethic and grew up on a farm, maybe in Wisconsin, was under Franklin Roosevelt. So that's the 1930s, 40s. This is 1920s. And Aldo Leopold is one of the interesting sort of deep environmental thinkers in American history. And he and his brother Luna Leopold did a lot to bring about, I would like to say, well, Luna Leopold was more of a forester. If you've ever walked through the campus of UC Berkeley, it has a little creek in it called Strawberry Creek. And all along Strawberry Creek are different specimens of trees. They were all planted there by Aldo Leopold's brother, Luna Leopold, who was a faculty member at UC Berkeley. Aldo Leopold had the unhappy task of protecting cattle and sheep in Western states where cattle and sheep were grazing on federal land, which is allowed. It's Bureau of Land Management land. And he saw a big wolf, and he took out his rifle, took aim, and shot the wolf. And he saw the wolf go down, but he wanted to make sure. So he rode over to where he saw the wolf fall. And sure enough, it was a very large, as he referred to her as a she-wolf. And she's looking at him. Well, her eyes are open. And she's looking at him, and he's looking back. And this penetrating gaze of this wolf sears him to his bone marrow. And at that moment, the wolf dies. And as he put it, a fierce green fire went out. So he changed. He decided, no, you don't kill the wolves. The wolves were here first. Maybe we should tell the sheep ranchers and the cattle ranchers, to either accept a mortality rate among their animals. I mean, the wolves aren't going to go after your best cow. You're going to go after the slowest. So we constantly misconstrue the role of apex predators in wildlands, particularly if we're sharing that wildland with economic things like raising animals. But very controversial figures. Leopold, the Sand County Almanac and the Land Ethic are the two pieces of literature that students read in environmental studies. It's sort of like the precursor to environmental ethics today. There, once again, you're seeing a beautiful place. This is going to be, where does it say? Conservation might, many people. Oh. Well, it just talks about preservationism versus conservationism, which we've just discussed. Now we go to more contemporary people. So there's Rachel Carson. She writes Silent Spring. She could have written it as a paper in a journal. In fact, her colleague said, yeah, why don't you just put it in a science paper? And she said, because nobody will read it. She was absolutely right. She wrote Silent Spring for a lay audience. She wrote it for a mass audience. And it warns people about DDT. And if we go on using DDT, the eggs of birds will crack and there'll be no birdies and we'll have a silent spring. By the way, where I'm living, I'm hanging out at my brother's house. There's one bird or two out there that sing all night long and all day long. It's just amazing. I don't know how they don't get tired. They just keep singing and singing and singing. So Rachel Carson wrote a lot of wonderful books about the oceans, but this book made history. She changed the environmental movement. Before Rachel Carson, the environmental movement was Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, even Aldo Leopold. In other words, the preservation of wildlands, the setting aside of those beautiful places of nature that needed protection. Enter Rachel Carson, and she says, well, that's all very fine. But the fact is, we live in a chemical industrial society, and the products that we're creating are destroying nature. They're destroying insects and birds all the way up the food chain. Give you an idea, there's a product you can buy at Home Depot to kill ground squirrels. People buy this product. It's a bromide. It comes in pellets, and ground squirrels dig burrows. So they put the pellets in the burrows to kill the ground squirrels. And then some ground squirrels will come out, kind of groggy from the poison, and they'll be eaten by a mountain lion. This has happened now in the Santa Susana Mountains and along the 118 freeway. Dead mountain lions from bromide poisoning, which is an anti-clotter. So it's a horrible way to die. You lose your ability to clot blood and you bleed from every orifice until you're dead. And they have found quite a few mountain lions where Rachel Carson was right. Poisons, they accumulate and they magnify. So the concepts we have of biomagnification and bioaccumulation we really owe that to Rachel Carson's emphasizing how DDT was going to stay. It's persistent in the environment. It doesn't break down. It lasts decades, and it goes on having toxic effects long, long after it's been applied. So thanks to Rachel Carson, she never lived to see that 10 years after her book, the EPA banned DDT. Well, they banned its use. She died of breast cancer 2 years after she wrote the book. So she did not know that she had changed the face of environmentalism forever. And so thanks to her, we have what Van Jones called the second wave of environmentalism. And that is environmentalism based on science and data. This is Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org. Notice that 350.org has that little arrow in the 3 that points to the left. If anybody knows why is there this organization that's I think in 140 countries, it's mostly young people, why is it called 350.org? And you can unmute yourself, and if you know the answer, and now we'll start the clock. We're sorry, contestants, you do not win $200. But you will know what 350 is because that is the number. It's a magic number of how much carbon dioxide we can tolerate in the atmosphere before things go south. And that number is 350 parts per million. They chose that, it's a climate organization, because it's a number. So it doesn't matter what language it's in, it's 350.org. So everybody knows what 350.org is in India and in Zimbabwe. And so that's why the arrow points left, meaning 350 or less. We're at 420 right now. We blew past 350. But we're told that we would not be heating the planet if we could reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere back down to 350 parts per million. And we aren't going to be able to do that without sucking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's true that trees do a good job of that, but it does raise the question, how are we going to get that stuff out? So we'll talk about that when we get to the chapter. Van Jones, I mentioned to you, he identifies 3, maybe 4 periods of environmentalism. The first one being wilderness protection. The second one being Rachel Carson's science-based environmental regulation. So that's the regulationist era. The third one is well, it depends. Sometimes Van Jones says it's the movement for environmental justice, where the negative impacts, like we saw in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, that negatively affects the majority of the people there who happen to be African American. So it's an interesting way to understand why we're in a different period today, and why in some ways we're having a harder time with environmental regulation. When Rachel Carson comes out with Silent Spring, it's President Richard Nixon who creates the EPA and who bans DDT. And he was a Republican president. So during that period of time, Republicans and Democrats tended to agree on issues regarding the environment. And that's why we got some pretty, I'm going to use the cliche, robust environmental laws from that period, 1970s, 1980s. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan and Ann Gorsuch began their dismantling project in the 1980s. And then in 1992, Speaker of the House, whose name I'm blocking, decides that we don't work with Democrats on anything at all, with no more bipartisanship. And it's been that way, Newt Gingrich. It's been that way since Newt Gingrich. In other words, if the Democrats say, we should put a bikeway here, a Republican will say no. So no is, they're the party of no. They get off on what they call owning the libs. So you'll see just incredibly irrational opposition to things that make sense that we should have had a long time ago, like regulating Wall Street. And finally, Wangari Maathai, a wonderful woman, and she passed away some years back. She started the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. That thanks to Wangari Maathai, there are many African countries that are planting trees like no tomorrow. And she set up a wonderful system in Kenya for rural people to plant trees and restore ecosystems and ideally bring back a more regular rain cycle, since Kenya, like many South countries, is tropical, but it has a very pronounced dry season and a very pronounced wet season. So she was despised by then President Daniel Arap Moi. She was considered, a gadfly and a bother by the patriarchal establishment of Kenya. But the truth is that she really did change. She won a Nobel Prize. She won a whole bunch of prizes. She was the first African woman to win a Nobel Prize for her environmental work in Kenya, Wangari Maathai.
I think that it is very, very important to continue encouraging our governments and ourselves that the environment is not really an issue for tomorrow. The environment is everyday issue. It's the air we breathe. It's the water we drink. It's the food we eat. And we can't live without these things.